Imagine an America forged not from the brutal, forced labor of enslaved people, but from a different set of economic and moral choices. What if the transatlantic slave trade, which brought millions of Africans to the Americas in chains, never took hold in the colonies that would become the United States? What if, from the very beginning, the nation's founding documents were not stained by the hypocrisy of espousing freedom while building its wealth on the backs of enslaved human beings? This is not a simple thought experiment, it's a profound journey into the very soul of a nation. It's an exploration of a past that never was, and a future that could have been. In our history, the institution of slavery shaped every facet of American life, its economy, its politics, its society, and its culture. It was the central cause of the Civil War, and its legacy of racism and inequality continues to haunt the nation to this day. But what if that original sin was never committed? What if the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, was actually lived up to? This is a timeline where the American story is completely rewritten. The history books would be different, the economy would be different, the politics would be different, and the very identity of the nation would be unrecognizable. This is a look at a different America, one without the deep-seated divisions that have plagued it for centuries. It is a story of a nation with a chance at a true new beginning, and a powerful look at the profound ripple effect that a single moral choice can have on the course of human history. The point of divergence: to imagine an America without slavery, we must find a plausible point of divergence. It's not a single event, but a series of interconnected choices and circumstances that lead to a different path. Our primary point of divergence is a combination of two key factors: a successful abolitionist movement in England that sets a new moral standard and a devastating, early century crop blight that makes large-scale cash crop farming less profitable. First, imagine that the early English abolitionist movement gains more political power and influence. Instead of a gradual process, the British Parliament passes the Abolition Act decades earlier, in the mid-1700s. This early act would not just ban the slave trade but would make it a moral and economic pariah across the British Empire. In the colonies, this would create a new reality. The southern colonies, which were just beginning to build their economies around cash crops like tobacco and cotton, would face severe restrictions on the importation of enslaved labor. Without a steady, cheap supply of labor, the economic model of the plantation would never fully develop. The early economic viability of the southern colonies would be severely stunted, forcing them to find new, more diverse ways to build their economies. Second, let's introduce a devastating, persistent blight that affects tobacco crops in the mid-17th century. The demand for tobacco remains, but the yields are so low that the crop is no longer a cornerstone of the southern economy. This removes the primary incentive for landowners to seek large-scale, cheap labor. Without the economic engine of tobacco and cotton, the southern colonies would be forced to adapt. Instead of vast, single-crop plantations, they would develop smaller, more diverse farms. The labor would be provided by a combination of indentured servants and paid workers, a system that, while still exploitative, would not lead to the brutal institution of chattel slavery. This fundamental shift in the economic structure of the South would mean that by the time of the American Revolution, the ideological divide over slavery would not be a central issue. The Southern states, with no economic interest in the institution, would be far more willing to align with the founding ideals of freedom and equality. The Three-Fifths Compromise and other compromises that enshrined slavery in the Constitution would be non-existent. A different America, one truly founded on the ideals of its Declaration, would be born. The consequences of this divergence would be profound. The Southern economy, while less wealthy, would be more diversified, with a greater emphasis on small-scale farming and local manufacturing. The population of the South would be more racially and culturally homogeneous, but the foundation of the nation would be fundamentally more just. The nation's original sin would be a moral victory, but also a social and economic upheaval that would change its course forever. A different economy and society with no slave labor to rely on, the American economy would be fundamentally different. The South would never become the dominant agricultural power it was in our history. The vast plantations of cotton and tobacco would be replaced by a more varied and decentralized economy. Small-scale farmers, sharecroppers, and a class of paid agricultural laborers would become the norm. The South's economic development would more closely mirror that of the North, with a greater focus on industrialization and urbanization. This would lead to a more balanced national economy, without the deep, ideological, and economic divide that defined our history. The absence of slavery would also lead to a different kind of society. The culture of the South would not be built on a rigid, racial hierarchy. Instead, it would be a society with a far greater degree of social mobility and a more egalitarian set of values. The wealthy landowning class would be less powerful, and a larger, more independent middle class of small farmers and merchants would emerge. This would lead to a different kind of political culture, one that is less defined by the need to protect a deeply unjust institution. The South, freed from the moral and economic burden of slavery, would be a very different place, one that is more integrated into the national fabric rather than a separate, distinct, and antagonistic region. The racial dynamics of the nation would be unrecognizable. The centuries of systemic racism, Jim Crow laws, and segregation that defined our history would be non-existent. The population of the United States would be different as well. The African population would be much smaller, consisting primarily of free people who arrived as merchants, sailors, or skilled laborers. The cultural exchange between Europe and Africa would be more equitable and voluntary. A new, more positive relationship between the two continents could be forged, one based on trade and mutual respect rather than conquest and exploitation. The contributions of African culture to American music, art, and language would still happen, but as a result of a free and voluntary exchange, not from the crucible of oppression. This would create a society that is not only more just but also more culturally vibrant and harmonious. The story of America would not be one of a struggle to overcome its past, but a story of a nation that, from the very beginning, chose a more moral, and ultimately more prosperous, path. The racial tensions that have defined our history would be absent, replaced by a society that is more united and more equal. The new political landscape without the institution of slavery, the American political landscape would be completely unrecognizable. The central conflict that led to the Civil War, the greatest tragedy in U.S. history, would never have existed. The nation's founding documents, unburdened by the compromises over slavery, would be a far more powerful and consistent statement of its ideals. The Constitution, written without the need to appease slaveholding states, would be a document of true freedom and equality, a beacon for the rest of the world. The American political parties would also evolve along different lines. The Democratic-Republican Party and later the Democratic Party would not be the party of the South, and the Whig and later Republican parties would not be solely defined by their opposition to slavery. Instead, the political divides would be based on more traditional issues like economic policy, states' rights, and federal power. The Solid South, a powerful political bloc that dominated American politics for over a century, would never have existed. This would lead to a more fluid and dynamic political system, one that is not defined by a sectional and moral divide. The presidency, the Congress, and the Supreme Court would be free to focus on other issues, from industrialization to westward expansion, without the constant, all-consuming debate over the future of slavery. The absence of the Civil War would also change the nation's identity. The United States would not be a nation forged in the fires of a brutal, fratricidal conflict. Instead, it would be a nation that, from its inception, chose the path of peace and unity. The scars of that conflict, the millions of lives lost, the families torn apart, the deep-seated resentment that defined the nation for a century, would be gone. The national narrative would be one of a successful, peaceful expansion, a beacon of freedom and democracy for the world. The military would be smaller, and the national budget would be more focused on infrastructure, education, and social programs. The United States would become a global power, not through conquest or a brutal war, but through the moral and economic strength of a nation that was truly free. The story of America would not be one of a struggle to overcome its past, but a story of a nation that, from the very beginning, chose a more moral, and ultimately more prosperous, path. The racial tensions that have defined our history would be absent, replaced by a society that is more united and more equal. This timeline, one where slavery never happened, shows us the profound, and often hidden, consequences of our historical choices. The ripple effect of a single moral decision, the rejection of human bondage, would have created a completely different America. Would have been a nation with a different economy, a different society, and a different political system. The Civil War, the defining conflict of our history, would never have occurred, and the legacy of racism and inequality that has plagued the nation for centuries would be absent. This is a powerful, and deeply moving, look at a nation that could have been. This is not a tale of a perfect utopia, as human nature is still flawed. There would still be inequality and conflict. But it is a world where the central, most destructive force in American history was never allowed to take hold. It is a world where the promise of freedom and equality was, for the first time, a true reality. This is a powerful, and deeply moving, Look at a nation that could have been, and a stark reminder that our choices, both big and small, have a lasting impact on the world. If slavery never happened in America, would another country have filled the void as a global superpower, or would the US still have risen to power? Without the conflict over slavery, what do you think would have been the main cause of the US Civil War? How would the absence of slavery have changed the global economy, and would another region have become the dominant agricultural power instead of the South?